Okay, everybody, welcome to the November 30th, 2016 special edition of Kubernetes SIG Service Catalog. So today we have a pretty full agenda. For that reason, I suggest, let's see, we have 5 main bullet points on the agenda here. Let's time box them to 10 minutes a piece. And let's see, if somebody would start a 10-minute timer, let's go ahead and begin talking about the first point on here, which I will paste into the chat. And I created this issue today, which is basically, so I have found myself saying, well, you know, we should try to emulate what Kubernetes does. Kubernetes does X, Kubernetes does Y, and like I am not a fan of arguments to authority. So issue 79 articulates in fairly exhaustive detail my rationale, which is like behind the shorthand of, well, Kubernetes does it X or Y way. And I'm going to go ahead and just bring this up so I can articulate what not distracted Paul wrote down for this. And actually, I'll go ahead and share my screen so that those recording can get some goodness out of that. And okay. I can't figure out how to share just this window, so we will look at my desktop. So, can everybody see my screen now? Okay. So issue number 79 lays out my rationale for why I think that we should strive to like the highest possible level to make this project look like Kubernetes. And I tried to make a strong argument on the merits of this because, as I said, I'm not a fan of argument to authority. And developers especially hate argument to authority, so let's not go there. But the main points are basically that the system that we are building, the design that we talked about, is in many ways like a little Kubernetes fractal that is going to be structured very similarly to the main Kubernetes repo. As we become more popular, I expect that there will be a high degree of people who are coming in from Kubernetes, like that have experience in the main repo, that are going to be wanting to contribute. And I think it will be in our best interest if we can make that transition, the context switch associated with it, as minimal as possible. I also want to point out that like this pattern that we have of we're going to make a little Kubernetes-like thing with a much smaller problem space is one that I expect play the movie forward 6 months, 1 year, especially after API federation becomes the norm, that we are going to have a lot of folks that want to make things that are structured like Kubernetes, which are tiny little smaller micro Kubernetes with different problem spaces. And I think that since we're one of the first folks, group of folks to want to do that, it would be great if we could point to this repo and say, hey guys and girls, everybody who's interested, here's an example of a way to do this so that you can jump into this thing with minimal overhead, just lead by example type of stuff. The next is that I expect when we begin incorporating some of the concepts like code generation for conversions, API conversions, YAML and JSON parser generation, and other ideas that are currently in the main repository, that we will want to get assistance from Kubernetes maintainers. And it's going to be easiest to do that if they don't have to learn something that is wholly new. And then those pieces that we are going to want their help with are also very opinionated right now. And the path of least resistance is very much towards just kind of go with the flow rather than to begin discussions about generifying those things. I know that basically everybody that's working in this repo so far is really interested in expediency. And so that number, that fifth bullet point there is really about the expediency aspect. So with all that said, I want to just say, like, I realize this is a big ask. I'm a developer. I've been a developer for a long time, and I think a normal developer behavior and preference is to want to make your project layout one that you're comfortable with. So for an example, a lot of you have experience with Java, and really popular dependency management tool in Java is Maven, and Maven is extremely opinionated about the layout of a project. And one of the most common things that people take issue with about Maven is, like, it works really well if you adhere to their opinionated preferences and assumptions. Not so great if you don't. And a lot of people chafe at this, right? Like, they don't. It rubs them the wrong way, and I completely understand that. And so I want to just acknowledge that this is an ask. I understand that about behavior, developer behavior. I understand that certain aspects of how Kubernetes is laid out and some of the community practices are alien, especially if you have a lot of Go experience on other projects that don't have the same adherence to the same conventions. And that I also realize that certain aspects have, like, a cultural history, which isn't easy to absorb if you don't have experience in the community. And so I just want to acknowledge, like, since I am making this ask of all of you, and it is basically one of trust that if we do this, it will be best for us in the long term, that, like, I acknowledge and appreciate differences of opinion on developer experience, project layout, and I just want to acknowledge that it is an ask of trust, so that no one feels like if you want to do X thing that someone's like, well, look at issue 79, it means you don't matter. That's not what it means at all. It's really more a question of utility and trying to go along with the community that we're part of. So thank you for listening to me talk. If anybody wants to respond to this, let's go ahead and have it now. We've got about 3 minutes on the 10-minute timer, if my math is correct.
So my only thought is I think it's perfectly fine to go and follow. I think Doug put it best in one of the things, which is consistency, right? I think that is fantastic. I think my only thought was that if there are things that we know that are incorrect in the Kubernetes for some reason, are there any plans for them, for example, to move off of it, so that we don't go ahead and start down the path of doing something wrong just to go and then migrate it out of there later on? That was my thought there. So if, for example, let's say using the Go deps, that they have a plan to go ahead and move into Clyde as an example, right? Then it would make sense to go ahead and move into Clyde now and say, yes, eventually this will look like that. That is my only thought on that.
Yeah, so that's a good point. And I hear you. At the same time, there's also, like, there's a finite amount of energy that we have in the group and a finite amount of social and temporal bandwidth that we have to work with. And so I can appreciate, like, if we think we've got a better way, then let's not throw that way out. But I also would like to, if we feel like we have a good idea to share with the community, I would really like to start by sharing with the community in, like, a mailing list, instead of developing, like, a high procedural and practical delta between what we do in the incubator repo and in main Kubernetes. Does that make sense? That's my own personal preference. Not trying to be dictatorial.
Yeah, Paul, this is Kent. I think that this really makes a lot of sense. But I think to Ville's point, I think that maybe we need to not just be looking at the changes that they're considering implementing in the way that they do things, but I think if we perceive something to be a mistake or even maybe painful in the way that they do things, I don't think we should be keen to repeat it. So just as an example, because I think a lot of the issues and PRs that I've started to open probably tipped my hand in terms of me being very focused on ensuring a very smooth and positive developer experience. With the few modest contributions that I've made to the actual Kubernetes core, my feeling is that it's not a very positive experience for a new developer coming into that project. Doing something like building Kubernetes from source for a specific target operating system and architecture, for instance, is an incredibly painful thing to do. You can easily waste 8 hours digging into undocumented build scripts and things like that, trying to figure out how things work. And I don't think that we should necessarily be eager to repeat or adopt the kind of developer experience that they have. So adopting their structure in general seems like a laudable goal, but I think that we should be wary of repeating some possible mistakes.
Yeah, so I hear you. I think that in the case of the comment that you just made, that the comment contains in certain ways a way to address the issue, right? Like and I've hit this too. Like I've spent the vast majority of my time over the last 2 years developing for Kubernetes in my professional life. So I can empathize with those things, and I think the key here is documentation. And I know that there's already been discussion about some people want to build for Mac, and I think that is totally makes sense. We should have a way to do it. Part of this is like tending the garden, right? We need to ensure that as we do things like make a build for Mac or a cross build for different operating systems or architectures, whatever, that we document it and that we keep that documentation up to date. So I think this becomes more and more important as things get more popular. Like an experience that we had with the main Kubernetes repo is that it became popular at some point, like in faster than people could cope with the increasing popularity. As something gets more popular, you have more people that are like, hey, I want to work on this thing and I don't even know what I want to do. I just want to do something because it's the hot thing right now. And I think there were like a few inflection points where Kubernetes increased wildly in popularity, had a ton more people coming in, a ton more people making contributions, and like not all of those people turn into folks that actually continue to work on the project. There's people that want to land like vanity commits, people that are like always chasing the new thing, want to play around. That's a totally natural, those behaviors are all completely natural, but we need to ensure that as we grow this repo and make it do more things, that we try to keep documentation on how to do those things up to date. So this, I hope that you all can search your memories, and I hope this is consistent with my prior behaviors of wanting to have use cases written down, wanting to have documentation for how the API is used, because those are like almost impossible to do if you go 6 months down the road and you need to do it from scratch. It's much easier to tend them from the beginning than it is to put them together afterwards. So I think some of your concern, Kent, is one that documentation can solve. Do you agree?
Yeah, to a large extent, yes.
FYI, it's 20 after.
Yes, we are at time for this thing. Unless folks really want to continue discussing it, and we can have some discussion on the GitHub issue and discuss in our next meeting. But we probably do need to move on for now.
So I think
I would like to say that I did summarize my points in the GitHub issue, so hopefully people can review those. I don't think it makes any sense to reread all of it here, but I do think that they're worth considering.
Okay. Yeah, I saw that you added those things, Martin. I appreciate it. I haven't had a chance to read them in detail yet, but I will, and I'll write something in there to at least let you know that I have read it and thought about it.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Let me just say one more point on this is that, like, I completely agree. Like, there is no reason to do something that nobody likes just to be consistent. I hope that we will find, as we like gradually nudge the repo in this direction, that those things are limited. But we do need to move on, so let's do that. I think the next thing on the agenda is glide versus check-in dependencies into vendor. I am not sure who added this. Would you put your hand up or speak, and I'll let you introduce this topic?
Isn't it the GKE GCR dependencies, the issue 77?
I think this is a different dimension. This is about managing Golang dependencies, like whether they are checked into a vendor directory.
I know, but I'm
dynamic.
pointing out that the next point on the agenda is not glide, but it's the bullet point above. The discuss decoupling, but yeah, that one.
Oops,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I skipped. Dang it. Okay, I'll reorder them in there. Let's talk glide for now.
So I added that one based on the discussion that several of us had in email on Slack and whatnot, whether we check in dependencies or do glide or GoDep or whatnot. And an interesting point is, like, since we want to align with Kubernetes, I hear they're moving to Bazel. Should we do that instead? So I just wanted to give opportunity to people to discuss. There was a good discussion on Slack. Is there anything else to add? Has the decision been made? I don't think it has, but it may be worth arriving at one here if it's possible.
Yeah, so I think there's a few different dimensions to this. The one dimension is, do we check vendor dependencies in? Another dimension is, which tool do we use to manage the vendor directory? And then a third dimension is there a supplemental build tool like Bazel that we want to use? And let me say, first, on the subject of Bazel, I am not yet comfortable enough with Bazel personally that I will advocate its use in this project yet. Can we resolve this now? Does anybody feel strongly that we need to pursue Bazel at this point?
I personally don't feel the need to pursue it, although if it is the future of Kubernetes core, it does bring the question back to what degree do we want to align with where Kubernetes is heading, and to a degree make ourselves arbitrarily different. Like, personally, I have used Bazel. I like it. For this project, we didn't go that way for the seed code with similar rationale. It's just another tool, another dependency. It's written in Java, so I'm totally happy.
I think Bazel is a little out of scope for this particular discussion. As I understand it, the discussion is just about dependency management.
Yeah.
Which Bazel actually does.
But it does a lot more. I think it's awesome. I would love to go towards it personally, but I think we should probably scope this discussion just to only dependency management. So if Bazel is the one, and we're willing to take on the additional complexity of the builds and everything, that's cool with me. But I just wanted to bring that up. I personally think it's out of scope.
I want to leave Bazel on the spice rack for now.
That's reasonable.
So regarding vendor directory, my strongest influence with regard to vendoring is I think that it is that in the next 2 to 3 months, we will probably reach a point where we need to vendor so that we can carry patches against dependencies. If I understand Glide correctly, and I probably don't, but if I do, I don't know of a way with Glide where you're using Glide similar to how Maven downloads your dependencies and populates them on disk so that you can use them. I don't know of a way to carry a patch against a dependency solely using Glide without checking things into the vendor directory. Is that possible to do?
It is possible.
You're right. The only way to do it is if the patch is checked into the dependencies repository and it has a tag or a branch associated with it or a commit associated with it. So for purposes of this discussion right now, we can treat Glide and GoDeps as the same functionality.
Yeah.
So just as GoDeps downloads stuff into the vendor directory and Kubernetes happens to check it in, Glide also downloads stuff, does a git clone or a HG checkout or whatever it's called. I'm not very up on Mercurial. Just as GoDeps does that stuff, Glide does that the same and puts it into the same directory structure under vendor, and we can choose to check that in too.
Yeah, so I will say, I don't know that it will be a good return on investment energy-wise to argue GoDeps versus Glide at this point. I do want to converge on what Kubernetes uses in the main repo. I'm totally happy if we can agree for now that that we should vendor these dependencies. And I feel where people are coming from when they say, well, that makes the git checkout enormous. It does, but you download the same code either way, whether Glide does it after you do a clone or you do it during checkout. And the advantage of doing, excuse me, of getting it during a clone or a pull is that you don't get fooled into thinking you have everything you need to build before you get on the plane. And you're like, hey, I cloned this repo. Then now I can't download this stuff. So that's sort of where I'm coming from. I really don't want to be prescriptive though. How do people feel about the vendor versus download at time of use question at this point?
I think your argument about doing a clone and knowing that everything is there without having to worry about dependencies getting pulled down later is actually really a good one, because that airplane example is something I can see myself doing. But let me ask a slightly different question. How do people right now handle patches when there's a vendor directory? Ignoring whether it's Glide or GoDeps or that created the vendor directory. In your experience, Paul, how do people handle those patches?
So what we do in Kubernetes, and we follow this pretty closely in OpenShift, is that we will apply a patch to the vendor directory as a commit. And I'm actually far more familiar with this process in OpenShift than what we do in upstream, but basically there is a marker, some kind of so in OpenShift, there is a convention that we use to say, this is a patch we're carrying for a dependency, because we constantly rebase all of OpenShift on all of Kubernetes, if you folks can believe that. And we need a way to, we need a convention so that the people who do this rebase that are barely holding on to their sanity because that's their job, it can sift through what needs to be retained and what can be dropped. So we have a similar process in upstream where you make a pull that changes the vendor directory. And I'll have to do some research on the specifics, but the crux of it is that, you have a commit that actually manipulates code in the vendor directory.
Okay, so but that's what I'm trying to understand. So I do a PR that says, oh, I need to do a patch to some dependency. I make a change to the vendor directory, and we accept that PR. Great. Okay, it's part of our vendor directory. Now, if we need to do a refresh on that vendor directory, how do we do a pull and then like a rebase? I mean, how does that new patch get applied on, say, the new version of Kubernetes that we just vendored in?
So in the case of OpenShift, we do have to rebase dependency patches.
Okay, so you then have to keep track of what is, in essence, the master of the vendor and what patches we made on top of that, and then reapply those. Okay, got it.
Yeah, and like I see stuff in the chat that says sounds painful. It's super painful. It only works because we have people with brains that are like so big that they're just throbbing. You can see their like brain wrinkles through their skulls. They're so big.
I think it's safe to say that isn't how anybody here wants to spend their time, though, right?
It's not how anybody wants to spend their time, but if you got a bug in a dependency and you can't get it fixed in time, you don't have a choice.
There's a much more sane alternative, which I put in the chat, right? Is that you fork the thing that you need to patch, and in your glide.yaml, you point at that fork. We do it all the time. But
does that assume that, okay, so is that fork maintained at sort of a project level?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's not a personal fork. It's like a project level fork, and that way you can have a whole bunch of changes or patches applied to that fork, but there is still just a project-wide fork that you use instead of the official repo.
You could. That's correct.
Right. Okay. Got it. Thank you.
Okay. So I think this might be an area where like maybe we can punt on it. Honestly, I'm agnostic on it for now. I think that we can handle it at an as needed basis, but I will say like I think that we will probably need to, before we release anything for this, go to a vendor directory so that we avoid problems of, well, I did glide wrong and then I got code that didn't work. But I can be convinced otherwise. By the way, I think we are out of time for this subject, so let's put it to a vote. I propose that we table this. We can live with Glide for now. I haven't used Glide, but I have learned things in the past, so I can probably get over the hump with that. And I think it's good to have had the discussion. I see Doug proposes Glide and check into the vendor directory.
Yeah, I wanted to just touch on that for a second. We can do the exact same thing with Glide as Kubernetes does with GoDeps, and I'm not a fan of that, but it'll bring us like that one step closer to what Kubernetes does. And when I say I'm not a fan of that, like I hate it, but I'm willing to do it as a kind of a step towards moving to what Kubernetes is doing more of.
And just to be clear, I understand. When we say Glide, we would be checking in the Glide YAML, Glide lock, and a GoDeps file?
No, we would be checking in, as we do now, the glide.yaml and glide lock, and also the vendor directory. And that's what Kubernetes does, except substitute glide YAML and glide lock with the godeps.json file.
Can I ask a silly question having to do with like governance here? When a project actually includes like the vendor directory in the repo, and something gets patched in there, like who's reviewing all of that stuff? Like how does anybody know that? How does anybody who's reviewing something know that a change in one of the vendor pieces of code is like a legitimate change and not like something that somebody else snuck in? Now, I'm not saying that there's any malevolent actor here or anybody acting in bad faith, but certainly as we pick up more contributors and things like that. I think that's something that we do have to be concerned about, is that somebody isn't like sneaking in a patch by.
That is a really good point, Kent. And I think that the carrying a patch for a dependency is sort of an option of last resort, absolute last resort.
How do you even detect when somebody might have done that without really advertising that they did it?
You have to pay attention to the diff stat of every PR.
I don't know that even works.
Yeah, I agree with you. It is technically an issue, but I think if someone ever found that out, that would be a cause for them to immediately get kicked out of the group.
Yes, I would say if I were to see somebody try to attempt this, I would be strongly biased towards not accepting further contributions from them.
Right. So consider the fact that this can even happen accidentally, though, right? We've all done this before, where we're hacking on like a Ruby project or something, and you start wondering, oh, I wonder what happens if I just change this line or add this bit of debug code to this gem. And you go to where that gem is on your system, and you just add the line that you want, right? The same thing is going to happen with the vendor directory. It's inevitable that that's going to happen, and stuff like that is going to get checked in accidentally. And I think it's better if we just use the glide.lock as a source of truth to pull down legitimate dependencies.
So just to comment on that, I understand that you're making an argument for not checking the vendor directory, but I just want to comment on, if someone does make a change like that because they're just doing a quick little debug thing in their vendor directory, chances are they're not going to be doing that at the exact same time that they're re-vendoring stuff. And it's very easy to notice those types of changes because it's a one-line change or so in the vendor directory, right? It's not like it's 8,000 files all under the vendor directory and it's just sort of hidden in there. I can't imagine someone making a debug change while they're doing a revender.
So who's to say a change like that never coincides with revendering? But even so, yeah. How are these changes also going to be maintained each time we revender?
Okay, so we are now 5 minutes over where we time box this to. Ken, you have a valid point, but we have to move on. I'm going to call this and say we have no conclusion we're drawing from this. And here's where I realized I should have been taking notes the whole time. So I'm just adding in here, no conclusion. We will rediscuss later. Let's move on to decoupling build and deploy processes from Google Cloud, GKE, GCR. Kent, this was yours, right?
Yeah, so there has been some discussion about this already today, and especially with Martin. And I think that we're all pretty much in agreement, at least you, Martin, myself, and I've talked to Aaron about it as well, that we do want to eliminate the GCR bias. That looks relatively easy to do. I'm about halfway there. I'd be all the way there if I didn't have so many meetings today. So I'll PR that later.
Okay.
The thing that I think we should still talk about, though, is I think there's still a GKE bias that's kind of present in some of like the hacking scripts,
okay,
stuff like that. And I think that we should look to kind of eliminate those biases wherever we spot them. I think we should have a goal that this stuff simply runs wherever you have Kubernetes, whether that be GKE, Amazon, bare metal, or locally on something like Minikube. I don't think our preferences for one vendor over another should bleed into the repository.
So let me say a few words on this. I have corporate GCE and AWS accounts, and I very rarely use them unless I am testing change. As I think a bunch of you know, I've done a fair amount of work on Kubernetes storage, so occasionally I will do something that affects how GCE persistent disk works in Kubernetes or AWS EBS. For my development, like normally I run a local cluster, and I think that I would like it to be a requirement for us that we are local cluster friendly. I don't even use Minikube. I run the kubelet on my laptop because that's how I roll. It's the only way to fly if you want expediency of turnaround. So it's really, really important to me personally that we make things local cluster friendly. But with that said, my dirty little secret is that like the SIG leadership duties have been taking enough of my time that I have not had much time to actually play with the repo yet. So I am using Kent as my spirit animal on this subject because he seems to know what he's talking about with local clustering. EOF for me. What do others think?
I would like to add maybe a little history to why there is a GKE bias, and that is that I think all of that in the scripts or hack directory comes from our continuous integration Jenkins machinery that we kind of brought in with the seed code, which is kind of the subject of the next topic. So it exists because we have machinery that will essentially spin up GKE clusters and deploy catalog into it and run end-to-end tests on it. So to that extent, to the extent that we use some of these systems for testing, the bias will be present, whichever system we use, unless we make it completely agnostic and say in the Jenkins UI, there'll be parameters that will point the system to deploy into AWS versus GKE or whatnot. So just the history on it. As far as the individual local developer experience, the things that, the changes that Kent has made or is making will pretty much make it agnostic, and the rest of it is just Jenkins machinery.
Okay, so in response to that, I think that probably what we will naturally converge on is you'll have a Kubernetes cluster, you'll run the API server and controller in a pod. And so the machinery for where you spin that Kubernetes cluster up becomes sort of orthogonal to the content of the repo. If you're basically just saying point kubectl or Helm or whatever tool you're going to use to create these pods at a cluster, make pods, bam, you're done. This problem goes away. I would like to be as agnostic as possible because one thing that like we've seen in main Kubernetes repo is to maintain all of these different cloud compatibilities takes a lot of work. And if we can get to the point where we're just like we build a Docker image and deploy with kubectl into an existing cluster, I think this kind of mitigates that concern to a great extent. What do people think?
Not completely. I agree that to a large extent it does. The one thing that we imposed as a requirement on these intent tests, especially given that we're early into development and we mess up and we damage namespaces in Kubernetes and install things incorrectly. So we basically create a whole new cluster for each test and then shut it down afterwards, which is the thing that becomes impossible because that's the thing that has dependency on the target deployment space.
Yeah, so there's another concern that like steady state, play the movie forward 6 months. Part of our EDE on this is going to be given a running cluster, make sure that I got the secrets, make sure I got the config maps, make sure I got the SIP that I wanted, make sure that my pod descriptor was mutated in the way that I expected. So there may not be a way to completely eliminate this, but I think it bears careful consideration because it is a tough nut to crack. I need to spend a lot of time thinking about this, and it's something that's like on my mental list of hurdles that have to be jumped. I don't have a good answer for it now, but maybe we can at least all start thinking about it and try to make the dimensions of, I don't want to say coupling, but the number of bytes in the project devoted to a particular cloud provider as low as possible for now.
I don't disagree. I lost you kind of halfway through. I wasn't sure if you were arguing that if we have a long-running clusters in which we play, they accrue baggage in them which will affect potentially negatively any subsequent test we run against that cluster because of the setup that has been done and we kind of forgot that is there. Or if you're arguing that's actually a good thing, that we have that baggage because we always have to make sure that everything is cleaned up and redone from scratch correctly.
So I was actually making a different point. I was saying, like, if you look at where this project will be in 6 months, part of successfully end-to-end testing this project is it needs to play nice and do the right things in Kubernetes, in a Kubernetes cluster. So there is a problem of, to fully E2E this thing, it needs to live alongside a Kubernetes. And so it is natural that our test infrastructure for this project probably does involve spinning up a Kubernetes cluster.
So I noticed we have talked about two major topics here. We talked about E2E and build infrastructure, and then we started, I think, talking more about developer experience. So to circle that square, for lack of a better expression, would it be possible to pull out a lot of the common build and deploy infrastructure and then put on top some makefile targets to do the E2E tests, and then also put on some make targets to make it easy for developers to do builds, Docker pushes, so on and so forth? That seems like maybe that's a good, at least short-term solution here.
So in Kubernetes, what we have is a fairly large set of different cluster types that have their own directory under cluster that are for things like the main repo uses Salt to do this, and I don't want to go down that road necessarily. I'm not saying we should use Salt given the context earlier in the conversation. I'm just saying that, like, there is an infrastructure within Kubernetes to handle spinning up clusters on different clouds, and there might be some utility to doing something similar. In no way do I want to prescribe Salt for that. There's a number of different Salt-like things that people use, but the thrust of what I'm trying to say is that maybe we need a cluster directory with this is how you run this on AWS, this is how you run this on GCE, and if we have people that are like, hey, I really want to do this on other cloud, we have a good way for them to do that without just ripple effect through the whole repo.
Yeah, that sounds reasonable. Pretty much, I should have said it a little simpler. Pretty much, can we just focus on makefile targets right now that are, as Kent just wrote this in chat actually, that are vendor agnostic? You can use make deploy, set some variables or environment variables or whatever, and get this thing pushed up to Docker Hub and deployed onto Kubernetes cluster X, wherever that might run. Later on, then we can confront do we use Salt? How do we do E2E? All those bigger questions. But when that becomes required, we're going to have a more mature product. We're going to have a better idea of how to run E2E for this specific case, so on and so forth.
So I think that's probably a good incremental approach to take. Any other thoughts?
Obviously, I'm a thumbs up. I shouldn't have done that.
Yeah, I think that sounds good.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay. Sounds like the motion is adopted. Aaron or Kent, will you put a conclusion in here for this in the notes?
Yes.
By the way, for the first topic, I'm saying conclusion was group generally okay with this, but does not want to blindly do things that the group hates about Kubernetes for the sake of uniformity. Is that accurately where we left things?
Yep.
Okay.
Plus pending discussion in the issue.
Yes. Okay. Okay, so I think we probably have time left for this last, for the second to last bullet, and let me ask now, who's up for another meeting tomorrow at the same time?
I don't think I can make it.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, I can't either.
we Google folks can make tomorrow or Friday. So
Okay. So then, are we done with voice chat for the week? That would be okay with me. It takes a lot of effort to get a whole meeting together, you know. So and it takes effort to attend them. Are people okay shifting to Slack after this?
Yep.
Until next week.
yes.
Fine on me.
Okay.
Yep.
Modulo Google is going to be kind of out of touch tomorrow and Friday. We have something that takes us away from computers for long periods of time.
Okay. I hope it involves beer.
It does, in fact,
Awesome.
but other things as well, like a lot of work.
Ah, no,
Yeah.
not work.
Tequila.
Work is the worst. All right. So last topic for the day, continuous integration. Who put this on here?
I did.
Okay. You got the floor.
Yeah, quick intro. You probably noticed in the repo that there is a Jenkins file, and the Jenkins file refers some scripts in the script directory. Those are artifacts from the CI pipeline we run at Google for the purposes of building this code from ground up, and with a seed, it kind of made it in. So I was kind of deliberating, do we want it? Now that we have basic Travis, which basically does only unit tests at this point, which are kind of feeble at best, but we have it. But the Jenkins, in addition to what the Travis as we have it as of today does, is what we discussed earlier, spin up cluster in GKE, tear it down afterwards, deploy everything into it, start a service, bind to it, bounce API calls off of it to make sure that things actually work after every check-in end to end. We could look for ways to run this Jenkins against the GitHub repo as well. There is some challenges with who might have access to it. I'm not sure how to actually harden Jenkins. So for now, it's basically internal only to Google.
Hardening Jenkins is hard.
Right. So do we want to benefit from it, understanding that there is a limited ability to access it, and knowing that maybe over time we will beef up Travis and maybe do something else following the Kubernetes practices? Is it short-term useful, or should we just tear it down? Either option is fine.
So Doug has pointed a couple of times that maybe we can get some CNCF nodes and set up Jenkins there. Would that?
Yeah, I'd like to do that if we can.
What's the CNCF?
So the CNCF has, I think, like a 1,000 node cluster that was offered up by Intel exactly for the CNCF's use. I think this would be a perfect use of it.
Hey, can I say on like a slightly wider scoped point that we found in Kubernetes that it had a lot of utility to breaking out different CI jobs into different specific things. So like, for example, there is a set of scripts that verify certain things like go format, boilerplate, adherence, et cetera, those have their own job that like has a specific status in GitHub with your pull request. There's also one that just does the unit tests. And the idea is that like with many finer grained jobs, it's easy to figure out what happened. Especially, you know, with like a project of even moderate complexity, you tend to do like enough things in CI that if you have one CI job and it's like, hey, I failed, you get to have a magical 45-minute adventure sifting through the results of the single build. I think that we'll find that we can leverage Travis for some of those things more easily, and for certain things, we are going to need to go to a Jenkins. I think having a CNCF node that runs Jenkins, I do agree, Doug, it is slightly different, but now I've made a mistake, so we got to all live with it. Sorry, people. We will find quickly that only certain things we can use Travis for, but Travis does have some utility. Sorry, I beefed it up.
That's fine. So let me take the action item to go investigate what it would take to get a set of permanent nodes in the CNCF cluster that we can leverage, because I do think, regardless of how we use it, I do think we will need some nodes there, at least for some sort of Jenkins type of setup, perhaps even something much bigger than that later. But let's at least start that ball rolling and see if it's possible. Because I know in the past when we've used it, they wanted us to use it on a temporary basis, and obviously we need this on a permanent basis. So let me go and do some investigation there to see if it's even possible.
Yeah, I have the same impression about that 1,000 node CNCF cluster. We've used it for like some different performance testing and scale testing things within Red Hat, and it was very much on a temporary basis. So I'll be interested to see where that lands. It would be awesome if CNCF could have like a longer running, more permanent Kubernetes that people could use for permanent things. But I would suggest that probably the multi-tenancy capabilities are not fully there in upstream yet to make that a thing that I'd be interested in doing as an operator. So we'll see.
Right. So when I go there and ask for the initial request, how many VMs do people think I should ask for as a starting point?
Start with 100 and we'll negotiate down.
No, let me check. I think our Jenkins runs on actually Kubernetes cluster. So let me look up the size of it. In the meantime, I would like people to ponder the question: do we stay course and not touch the Jenkins machinery that is in the repo? Do we pull it out, or do we allow Google to keep advances in it, understanding that Google is running something internally that it helps, and if something breaks, we can notify people, but there is very little visibility from the outside into it for now.
So Martin, one thing that comes to mind is that the Kubernetes Google team has done a ton of work to make getting the results of those internal Google Jenkins builds publicly available. I don't know if the names in my head are stale or not. And I know you guys have added a ton of people on Cube. So one takeaway I can do from this is see if I can find which of your colleagues at Google to set the service catalog cubing Googlers up with, so that you can see if there's some economy of energy that we can get, at least from lessons learned, if not code shared.
Yeah, I chatted with Sarah about it, and she connected me with some folks. So I may be actually okay on this front. I'm pursuing some leads. In the meantime, the size of our cluster is 6 VMs, 30 gigs of RAM each, 8 vCPU. So it's a pretty beefy cluster, but I think it's bored most of the time.
Yeah.
Yes. And it's awesome. It's just the slaves. Then we have a reasonably decent sized VM that is the master.
Okay.
But it's fairly small, like 7 VMs total.
This is also probably an area where we can lead by example for other incubator repos that are interested in setting up CI. But hey, we're at time now. I don't like meetings that run over. I know other people don't. So I'm going to stop the recording here, and maybe we can continue talking on Slack. Everybody okay with that? Okay, cool. Thanks everybody for attending. Always nice talking to my SIG service catalog peoples, and I'll see you all on the internet. See ya.